start speaking in any case. The results of this research that I've been doing over many years will be placed in the public domain by the Leopoldina, a very large database with roughly 32,000 victims, with 60 elements of biographical data on each victim, also linked to perpetrators, the experiments, and prisoner assistants. And the victims will be named. I absolutely insist, in line with the International Holocaust Research Alliance, that there is no anonymization and that the medical data is really a form of violence and, in worst cases, murder. And I think that you cannot regard the medical data for these victims, sort of we have just heard, as confidential. But I think it is in line with the IHRA data requirements. Have you got me? Compensating victims?
No, just have a look, please.
Sorry. Okay.
It's not.
I'll go. Sorry.
Please, no.
Not redacted, no. No. It's called comparing compensation. It's not there.
Yeah,
It's one of these.
Oh, it's a PowerPoint slide.
Should we open one window or two windows, maybe? Just. Yeah, just do something.
Okay.
PowerPoint again.
No, it's comparing compensation. You should be able to find it alphabetically.
No.
Or by date, because it went on. Okay. No, it's my fault.
Shall I take the email from the email?
I'll take it from the email.
Okay.
It's not the latest. If we consider the overall dimensions of these medical experiments, what we find is that the first small wave is, of course, for the what we heard about for the Rhineland children who were forcibly sterilized. But from 1941 onwards, it goes exponentially up. So you get a sort of curve with 1942 and 1943 as really high points. We can have the graph. Mm-hmm. Good. So you'll know that. Yeah. Then the next slide, please. Yeah. So that you can see that we're talking about, during the war, very, very high rates of very high rates of new medical experiments. And what we have to remember is that some medical experiments went, like the malaria experiments, went through over many, many years, from 1941 to 1945, or the Sachsenhausen shoe track experiments. And overall, I'm currently at over 30,000 victims with 330 perpetrators, and overwhelmingly German and Austrians are the perpetrators, or ethnic Germans and so on. So that's the overall picture. I should go to work from this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. We've heard about the 1951 special program for compensating victims of medical experiments, and that we see it sounded very generous, so that victims of experiments who are ineligible for reparation on other grounds shall not be denied assistance. But the initial idea why they could be so generous was, but they thought they only had about 100 victims to compensate. And you can see that they are really large numbers who needed compensation. But, and this is the big but, overall, if there are over 30,000 victims, and I document victims not as groups, but as individual named persons, we can see that only, well, there are 40,000, just under 40,000, 39,060 in this compensation program that we've just heard about. so that you can see that only a tenth, roughly, of the actual victims were considered for compensation. And there are also cases where it's quite clear that victims who were genuine victims were refused compensation, but also on the other hand, you get cases of invented narratives as well. The Poles were expert at constructing narratives. You cannot, for example, have a non-Jewish inmate of Block 10 in Auschwitz. Now, if we compare Sinti and Roma and Jewish victims, for the Sinti and Roma, I have a question, which I would be very interested in discussion. Are the racial registrations of Robert Ritter, Eva Justine, are they research-oriented? Or are they just bureaucratic requirements? If they are research-oriented, we have a very, Sinti and Roma are the highest group. Otherwise, I have found 507. For ethnic Jews, the total number is to date 4,241, and killed in experiments 780. These are some examples, and they are only the major examples for the experiments on Sinti and Roma. I think they will be familiar to you. But one thing that emerges by using a relational database is that we can see that some victims, Taubman and Laubinger, they were used 3 times for different experiments. And by the 3rd time, Beigelberg, the perpetrating doctor, drew a pistol against Laubinger in order to make him comply with the seawater drinking experiments. So that can we move on?
I can do it here.
Thank you. But you can see that these are well-known experiments, like the heterochromic eyes and so on. Some definitely killing, and others are, like the seawater drinking, are not fatal, but severe. They take close to death. So that we see with Rudolf Taubman, also with in Taubman's case, he comes out of the so-called gypsy family camp. Small numbers are retained, small numbers of men are retained, deported to Buchenwald, and then from Buchenwald, there's as if they're a surplus labor force. So some get sent to Natzweiler for typhus experimentation by Eugen Hagen, and some go to Dachau, for example. We can move on. Okay. This is a case of Kurt Adler. He writes close to the end of his life to the Bundespräsident. He's at his wit's end. He's been denied compensation. Now, I regard him as a Gelbkreuz victim. He's not regarded by everybody as a Gelbkreuz victim. For example, by Florian Schmalz, who's done a very friend and colleague, who's done very careful analysis, because with these experiments, you have more than required. You have a few extras. So that he wasn't actually in the gas chamber, but he was deported from Auschwitz under terrible conditions and is held for the experiments. So he writes to the president, look, I've not been compensated for this awful experiment I underwent. What happens if you write to the German federal president? Your papers get sent back to the official who's caused all the problems, and you get nowhere, effectively. But it is a very vivid biographical account. of a non-compensation of either Sinti or Roma victims. We can go forward. Yeah. Then another example would be the Mengele twins. Now, although the Mengele twins are paradigmatic as classic case of medical experimentation in Auschwitz, they are not compensated. It is an absolute rule of the Federal Ministry of Finance. A twin experiment is not a medical experiment. And if it's not a medical experiment, you're not going to be compensated under the 1951 law. So that these two twins, Miriam Auerbach and her sister, they go to the German administrative courts to try to reverse the decision and get the compensation for the experiment that they are with Mengele, and there were all sorts of additional, how can I say, damages. One has a leg which was severely disabled, but the official of the Bundesfinanzministerium is absolutely rigid on this issue. A Zwillingsversuch doesn't count as the legal definition of a Versuche unzulässiger Art, that blood extraction, transfusion, injections, X-rays are investigative, but do not cause, are not intrusive in the body, so that the complaint is inadmissible and unfounded. And so what's very interesting is to compare the two twins as they go through different administrative courts and what happens. Does it? Yeah, it works. The result of the whole procedure is that one twin, it simply fails the application. The other both are claiming 4,000 marks. 4,000 marks is not a lot to be claiming, but the other twin, Yona Lux, she's actually has to pay the court costs. So she's fined roughly 3,000 euros. So that it's at the cost if you complain. So the Zwillings in Versuche don't normally involve interference in the integrity of the body. So they're absolutely rigid on this. What happens in 1980? It's taken up by the Bundestag, and we know that Mengele, the news comes through that Mengele has died. Once this happens, it triggers an international sensation so that it changes, and that there is a small compensation granted to each of the twins in West Germany. So it's different, how can I say, extracts from the administrative experiments. I actually had to note all this down. Only a couple of months ago has the Bundesarchiv finally given way and cancelled my application, allowed me to make a new application in which the Bundesarchiv lets me use a camera. Until then, for roughly 15 years, I've worked under very restrictive conditions, noting, and never getting through the roughly 3,000 files. But I think it's very important that one is able to. So yeah, this is the twins. So the largest group of twins are Hungarian in origin. There are all sorts of estimates of thousands of 3,000 twins or something like that. I don't think so. I think I have identified, here I state 526, actually it's slightly more. That coincides with witness accounts from Auschwitz. But we can see that here we have the much more generous Hungarian compensations. The Hungarian compensations are actually, they go to Bonn, and Bonn is notified. But it is the International Commission of the Red Cross, it's very clever of them, who roughly award 35, well, they award 35,000. What does the ministry say? So they say it is intolerable that East Angehörige des Ostblocks are better off than our victims. We have calculated very carefully. They calculated if it's an industrial accident. But they feel that they're getting roughly 10 times as much through the Red Cross as the ministerial calculations. So that they distinguish between the Ostfälle and the Westfälle, and that the Red Cross is also awarding medical, how can I say, injections for disinfection purposes, vaccinations, and all sorts of other benefits. So, how outrageous! So, it's not only ethnic groups who are discriminated against, it's also this East-West distinction. So some conclusions. Firstly, this 1951 system is based on single lump sum compensation. It's not like, it is a positive advantage to be transferred to the federal compensation law. The officials are antagonistic on the whole to claimants. They discriminate particularly against Sinti and Roma, but also against Jews roughly until the early 1980s, until that swings around and limited compensation is then provided under this law. Wiesenthal intervenes, and the West Germans are shamed into granting compensation. Most victims of the medical experiments, if they go through this system, are never adequately compensated. That's also clear, that you get sterilized and castrated men who are trying to recover their fertility through, if it's one testicle, through hormone treatment, and this costs more than whatever the meager compensation there is. Now, the files were transferred very late to the Bundesarchiv from the ministry, although they sat in the Bundesarchiv. In the 1990s, there was good access to them. I had access through a project on the Nuremberg trials with permission to have photocopies. That when I was granted access to research medical experimentation, there was no, it was absolutely firm that I couldn't copy, order copies, anything like that. And that my database on completion of my research was to be destroyed. After some years, the archivist said, could we have a copy of your database? So that changed, and in certain respects, conditions of work improved, but my files always came with a red ticket, no copying, which made life, it slowed down the research enormously. I'd like to say two additional things. Firstly, we have the International Holocaust Research Alliance, which actually already in 2017, the data exemption for Holocaust victims was already in place. That has been massively ignored. It's been ignored for euthanasia research, for example. It is ignored, I think, in a lot of provincial archives, but fortunately, Professor Hollmann, is it, the president of the Bundesarchiv, is on the commission now, and it is at the top level of German government records. It is acknowledged, and it makes a real difference to actually to be able to do this compensation research fully and thoroughly. I think the compensation applications, they might represent a type of injustice, but they also represent autobiographical accounts of victims under Nazism. And also, I think, finally, I'd come back to what I said in the beginning, for commemoration, but also for the methodology of research. How will you ever know that 3 victims were used for different experiments? So you need to do research, you need to do linkage. And in order to have record linkage, you need to have named identities. And I think in order to have an analysis as to what's going on, you need the diagnostic data, because the diagnostic data is, in my view, part of violence, persecution, and killing. So it is absolutely so. The normal protection which a patient would expect from a physician, and they can expect it for a considerable number of years, lapses once they are part of this persecutory regime. And so I think from that point of view, we need to work with names and with, how can I say, names and diagnoses. The names are fine. We have the, for example, the breakthrough with the T4 victims based online, finally, by the Bundesarchiv in 2019, I think. So that is a great step forward, but also names and diagnoses, because it does not make sense if you do not know the rationales for killing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.